Hello, everybody. My name is Mike Norton. I'm Chief Policy Analyst at Reinvestment Fund. And since it's probably not a household name for everybody, I'll give you the 2-second overview of what Reinvestment Fund is and why we might be connected to museums and libraries. So Reinvestment Fund is a community development financial institution based in Philadelphia, and it's best understood as a nonprofit bank. And we primarily make loans and grants to build affordable housing, to build food retail and food deserts, to do childcare facilities, to do FQHCs. In parts of the country, we fund charter schools. We do this work all over the country. I work in our policy solutions shop within Reinvestment Fund, and we are sort of a research and analytic function that helps our lending team identify places that are going to be advantageous for our kinds of capital, right? So we're looking for assets and community from which you can build strength out of sort of distressed places. And then we do independent consulting with government at every single level, federal, state, and local. We work with large foundations and anybody that's doing community development work that's designed to improve the quality of life in historically underserved places and from historically underserved borrowers. And we help them use data to inform their strategic deployment of their capital. And then we will work with them to develop ways to assess the impact of their work if they've been doing concentrated activities over a certain amount of time. And I'm going to stop and let Liz introduce herself real quick. Liz, you want to say hello?
Sure. Thanks, Mike. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Liz DeYoung. I'm currently a research scientist at the Center for Guaranteed Income Research at UPenn. But at the time that we did this research, I was a fellow at Reinvestment Fund, primarily a qualitative methodologist, and did a lot of work around the site visits and interviews that we'll talk about a little today. So looking forward to it.
Great. And so I'd say probably in 2015 or something, we Kit Matthew, who was at the time the director of IMLS, reached out to us and to Mark Stern, who was a faculty member at University of Pennsylvania, who we had done a lot of work with on understanding how the arts and cultural sector connects with social well-being in New York City and in Philadelphia, and asked if we would be interested in helping her and the museum and library field sort of think about the connections between museum and library networks and social well-being, broadly speaking. And so that sort of brought us into the museum and library space, and we've been connected with IMLS, going forward from 2016 till now, or 2015 until now, doing an initial pilot study and then the broader study that we did just recently that I'll talk about today. And one of the things that was really striking for us, and we continue to see as important everywhere we go, is sort of the connective tissue that these institutions provide within their communities, and particularly within small towns and rural parts of the country, in ways that are not broadly understood and certainly not broadly appreciated. In part because we don't have a really good story to tell about what it means, right? Until you go out there and see it on the ground happening. And so part of the work that we've been doing is trying to help people be able to articulate that story and thinking about the kinds of data that can be used to do that. So let me make sure my thing's going. There we go. So there's a quick overview of the kinds of things we're going to talk about today, because I want to make sure that we do have a lot of time to field people's questions, because even in the brief time that I had to listen to some of your conversations, I think everybody's heads here are in the right place for this kind of conversation. So I'm going to give everybody an overview of the study design and some of the main findings from understanding the social well-being impacts of the nation's museums and libraries. We'll talk about some of the implications of the findings, particularly for rural and small town libraries and museums, and then leave some time at the end for us to discuss, particularly with the research grant that is on the table, right, that your network is supporting, because it is in a lot of ways Margot used some of the things that came out of our work in designing the piece of work that's going on right now in Northern New York, which is pretty exciting. And it's exciting for us that someone has picked it up and trying to move it forward in an interesting and innovative way. So when we set out to start this work, it was, I think late 2017, early 2018, and we were really trying to conceptualize what are the kinds of things that what kind of contribution can we make to the field? Because we had done this really narrow pilot study in 2016, where we went to a handful of places and did some site visits and did a bunch of phone interviews and convened a bunch of folks in Philadelphia to get them thinking about social well-being and thinking about how their institutions are connecting with them. But we really were scratching the surface a little bit in terms of understanding how these things actually happen, right? And so on one hand, we wanted to sort of extend the findings from the pilot study to see how well they hold up at sort of a nationwide scale. And part of that was really trying to figure out a way if we could quantify the relationship between different dimensions of social well-being and the presence and usage of museums and libraries. Not so much to put our finger on sort of a causal connection, right, between them, because it is a very difficult thing to do from a methodological standpoint, but to just see if there was an association there. And if that association was there, because we suspected that it was, right, based on the work that we had done, the people that we had talked to, then we could use a way, then we would have another set of evidence to suggest that sort of digging into this is really worthwhile, right, and figuring out the mechanisms that make those associations happen, right? And so the idea being that if we're able to do these kind of things, it's really going to come up with some really helpful insights to inform these broader conversations about what it is that museums and libraries are doing that are promoting the well-being of their communities, right? And part of that is sort of understanding and conceptualizing what social well-being sort of looks like and how it operates in different places. So these are the three big buckets of activities that we set out to accomplish over the course of a 24-month study, roughly, is that we updated our literature review, and from 2016 to 2018, there wasn't a whole lot of new things that were going on, but there are things particularly around understanding the different types of economic impact studies that people have done over to estimate these impacts of museums and libraries, trying to understand sort of what these different ways that they are sort of promoting social well-being. And then we wanted to sort of put together this national look, right, of estimating the relationship between the presence and usage of museums and libraries and these different dimensions of social well-being. So I'll talk a little bit about those in just a moment. But then crucially, we did 24 different case studies across the country of museums and libraries. We went 24 different places, a mix of urban, rural, and suburban places, a mix of different types of museums, all public libraries. And so when we created initially these two indices, and these two indices, when we created these, were really designed to help us identify where we were going to go. Right? So what's really important here in terms of looking at the library index, these data are really good from the public library survey that IMLS administers. I'm not aware of any public survey at a national scale that has such an amazing response rate. So like, kudos to all of you who are filling out the PLS if you're doing it, because it's remarkable that it has a 95% response rate every year. But using these measures, we're really able to get a pretty good sense of where library presence and usage is sort of elevated, where it's lower across the country. Museum data are a lot fuzzier, right? Because there's so much heterogeneity within the museum category itself. Right? So you see here the criteria that we use to select the museums. We excluded any museum or library that was affiliated with an academic institution for conceptual and methodological reasons, but it's important to know that to see who's in and who's out. That's actually a completely separate study, right? If you're going to be doing something at a higher ed level. So really it only broke down to us really having information about revenue and the total amount of institutions in a place. And of the, I think, 23,000 or so museums that we had in the country, only about a third of them actually reported revenue in excess of $50,000. So it gives you a sense of the size of the museum population generally, right? So most of the museums across the country are tiny little bitty things. Some of them generate revenue, most of them do not, right? And it's really only a very small portion of the museum population that actually sort of is generating the kind of attention that anybody sort of pays at a national scale, like, oh, museums sort of drive X, Y, or Z, right? When at a population level, they're very small institutions for the most part and rely on their local communities to keep them going. And so when we look at the distribution of the library index, these green spots are the places where you have the most elevated library presence across the country. And we're looking here in up northern New York, you kind of have a mix, right, of counties that are pretty good and counties that are a little bit less well developed. And these are all going to be compared to other rural counties, right? So the index itself is all rated sort of urban, rural, micropolitan, and suburban, right, based on the criteria that the Office of Management and Budget had. There are problems with the way those geographies end up being defined, but generally this sort of represents what a lot of people sort of in the library space had felt when we went different places. Same thing here with the museum index, right? The museum index has a little bit more funny business going on with it, but in general, it kind of gives you a sense of where there are more museums concentrated, where the revenue is more concentrated. But there are sort of strange things that happen in the museum space, particularly when you're looking at 990s and IRS data. One thing in particular, just as an example, here in New Mexico, there is a very tiny museum that is a gun museum that's registered to the NRA that had hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue associated with it. But it had free admission, and less than a few hundred visitors. And so you get this sort of weird anomaly, right? That kind of pops up sometimes with strange things like this in the museum data. But at a population level, both of these indices gave us a way to start thinking about correlations with these different well-being measures, right? So when we're thinking, so on the one hand, we have this, where are our museums and libraries sort of concentrated? When we're thinking about social well-being, what are we thinking about, right? Because very broadly speaking, right, we're thinking about sort of all of the things that sort of collectively represent the quality of life for a person in the place where they live, right? So it's not just a single measure, right? And so we did try to estimate a single measure of social well-being, combining all of these different indices that you see here. It was very hard to interpret. And so what we did, and with each one of these, is we created 10 different dimensions, 10 different indices of social well-being that were indices created using the inputs that you see here, collected from publicly available data sources that were all aggregated to the county level. Right? So it's important to remember too, right, that the museum index, the library index, and all of these social well-being indices are all estimated at a county. And the county is a really big geographic unit, right? And the challenge of the county, particularly in an urban place or a big suburban place, is that there's a tremendous amount of internal variation within a county, particularly along these kinds of measures that you see here in terms of how we understand what social well-being means, right? And so what we wanted to do is do our best to try and isolate some of the relationships between museum and library presence and usage, and some of these dimensions of social well-being that are conceptually tied to the kinds of things that museums and libraries are doing. And so we really honed in on school effectiveness and on community health, but then we wanted to control for economic well-being, right? So we set up these analyses to sort of assess the association between the presence of museums and libraries, and on the one hand, school effectiveness, on the other hand, community health, controlling for the effect of economic well-being, right? And controlling for the whether it's urban, suburban, rural, and the non-white population within that place. And when we did that, we ended up finding some pretty compelling associations, right? And at a county level, it was really striking to see the relationship between the presence and usage of libraries in particular, right? The museum results were pretty hard to interpret, but the library results are pretty straightforward to interpret, right? So the greater concentration of library presence and usage, you have considerably elevated levels of community health, and you get some positive returns on education. And so this figure here on the left is the national figure for all counties, right? And so the orange line is the school effectiveness index, right? So you do get this sort of interesting sort of U-shaped curve, but the health index comes down from the lowest quintile, but then goes steadily up, right, into, on this end, are counties with the highest concentration and usage of libraries. And when you look only at the rural counties, this relationship, particularly with health, is really startling, right? Where you go from counties with the lowest amount of library presence and usage, and then by the time you are in the highest amount, you've increased by almost a half a standard deviation unit, which in wonky terms is a big deal, right? And particularly when we're looking at a county level, right? And so for us, this was really reassuring and affirming that the associations that we thought would exist, and based on the literature that exists, were sort of showing up in really large scale sort of associations in a quantitative way. And to be perfectly honest, we were very surprised to actually see these hold up this way, and we're very pleased to do it. And they informed the selection of our case studies and our ability to start to identify these connections around institutional connections and the cultural assets in a place. And I'm going to let Liz talk now a little bit about case study selection and some of the things that we found there.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, it felt really critical to complement the quantitative analysis by seeing this in practice and, seeing how it's operationalized and talking to the people who do this work every day and highlighting, that part of the story as well. So we selected 24 sites across the country, 12 libraries, 12 museums. And as Mike kind of talked about, where you're sampling at the county level, looking for places with elevated numbers of museums and libraries, and places that were high need or high performing on the school effectiveness and community health indices. Do you want to change the slide, Mike? We wanted to include a range of sizes, locations, and as you can see, we really ran the gamut from Children's Museum in Wyoming to botanical gardens to zoos, libraries at the urban, suburban, and rural level. And so these are our 24 case studies. The next slide shows, we went to these institutions knowing that there are some things we can't get at with quantitative methods alone. And so we sent research teams to 23 of these sites. We were fortunate enough to do data collection in 2019 and early 2020. So only one of our sites was, we did interviews over Zoom. But for the most part, we went to all these sites and we conducted interviews with library and museum staff members, community leaders, partners, and we were trying to get at a couple different things. We wanted to look at the ways in which place and environment shape the opportunities and challenges that each institution faces. I'm sure you all know, and it's probably been discussed, that rural libraries have a completely different purview to an urban one, for instance, and have to kind of wear many hats. We also wanted to recognize that programming and partnerships respond to and reflect the unique needs of different places. And the ways that networks operate are different from place to place. So in these site visits, in these interviews, we we found that we were really able to see and experience the extent and the depth and the strength of community networks and the networks that library and museum practitioners had built and the very palpable effect that they were having on their communities. So doing this kind of qualitative approach helped us identify the dimensions of social well-being that felt most immediate in each place. It allowed us to see how people in these institutions were responding to them and how networks were being constructed and maintained to support well-being, and how people's lives were improved by virtue of these institutions in ways that aren't immediately apparent or maybe measurable by quant methods alone. And so our key finding, one of them was really that, museum and library networks matter in so many different ways, and they're really critical to the vitality of communities, particularly, although not exclusively, in rural areas. So a couple case studies to highlight. We use these network maps that you'll see in our report. We also distributed them to all of the organizations that we worked with. And we use these as a way to highlight the degree to which institutions are integrated in their communities, and as a way to kind of visually illustrate how community networks overlap and complement and bolster one another. So you'll see this is a network map depicting Yavapai County, Arizona. Mike and I visited Yavapai in January 2020, and this is a district in Arizona with a service area the size of New Jersey. So in our interviews with staff and partners, people cited the Yavapai County Free Library District as a nexus for solving problems collectively, collaborating on issues where there are few public resources for solutions, and leveraging formal and informal networks to make this work happen and get things done across vast distances and really remote areas. One thing that we picked up in interviews was the Yavapai Library Network. The district set this up, and it brings together not only the county public libraries, but you'll see, school libraries, university libraries, resources within museums, all under the library network name. And when we went, there were 42 members to this network. Each paid dues according to their ability, and they all pooled their resources in a single platform catalog with books, digital resources, educational resources. The library district provided cataloging and organized distribution across the area. And so the effect was that, these collective materials were available to any network member or service user anywhere in the county, no matter how far away they were. Another instance of partnership that we saw was that the district co-located libraries in places that needed them. And this was really remarkable given the remote nature of a lot of the places that they serve. So one small library space was created in a one-room schoolhouse. Another remote area co-located a public library on school property for both students and the wider community. Another example, the library district, the school district, and the community college all worked together to retrofit this obsolete building into a high school library. And then, the district library jumped in and staffed and serviced it. And so these joint use facilities demonstrated the importance of partnerships in places where resources are scarce. And finally, we found that the district really acted as a facilitator of other networks as well. So, branches hosted public sector communications. You might be able to see there were workshops on building codes and flood prevention in these remote places. It served as a staging ground after a series of wildfires. People came to the library to connect and to process and to figure out how to rebuild their homes. So Yavapai, we saw the library district serving as a space for people to connect and come together and problem solve. We also visited a museum called the Tricities Historical Museum in Grand Haven, Michigan. I visited in February 2020, which was pretty chilly. It's a sleepy kind of coastal place in the winter, and then it sees a lot of tourism in the summer. And this museum had always had historical exhibits, but in recent years has reframed its mission to be more collaborative and public facing and kind of facilitate community networks. So in our interviews, we found that the museum had started building these robust partnerships beyond, your traditional field trips. They participated in a program called Future Prepped, which tasked area students with visiting the museum and charging them with a problem to solve. Problem solving, students worked on projects around interactive exhibits or integrating technology into the museum. And the program was so successful that there were a couple different offshoots with different age groups. The museum also extended into the community in a variety of ways. They had a dedicated community archive that was open to the public with the remit of kind of making history accessible. So they were stewarding artifacts for the museum in this archive, but they were also inviting the public to engage in genealogical research. They offered trainings on caring for people's own collections, their own heirlooms. They were strategic about thinking about other ways to get into the community. They had set up outreach exhibits on local history in libraries and government buildings. They partnered with the local library on a series of walking tours from cemeteries to like the history of local watering holes. So they were really, thinking about different ways to bring the museum into the community and vice versa. Curators were tasked with joining community organizations from the Rotary to preservation societies, and the museum also hosted events and concerts and art exhibits within its premises. And so these are two examples of places that, were small but mighty, in that the services and the interactions that both Yavapai and Tricities facilitated through their partnerships and through building and sustaining networks really became crucial threads in the broader social fabric of their communities, or connective tissue, as I think Mike said. And we learned that doing partnership and responding to community needs looks like a lot of different and exciting things depending on where you go.
Thanks, Liz. And I think one of the things that sort of came through for us in those examples and in all the other places we've been is sort of spelled out here in these implications for folks that are running museums and libraries, right? And it's really critically important, particularly coming out of the pandemic, and you're moving everything shut down sort of as we were getting near the end of this, right? And we did a whole series of follow-up interviews with all of our museum and library leaders in September of 2020. And so it was really, everybody was still pretty traumatized, right? In September of 2020, when some of them are starting to reopen, but all of them had taken time to reflect on how their institutional missions do or do not align with the needs in their communities. And everybody is doubling down on the institutional relevance of what they're doing, how they're meeting folks' needs, how they're understanding what they're going to need, and really attuned to that in a way that I think has really been the focus has really been sharpened in a way that it hadn't even before we started the study. And I think it's been increasingly clear too, right, that the relational networks are really the point through which so much of the benefits accrue, right, to the people who visit your institutions, to your patrons that borrow from you, who show up and activate some of the programming that goes on in your places. And so those relationships and those networks that sort of generate the social well-being benefits for individuals and for communities. And increasingly, and we saw this in a number of places, that libraries and museums are stepping forward to be sort of either active or sort of cooperative agents for promoting racial equity in their communities in the wake of the pandemic and sort of moving out of it, right? And in places that have experienced a lot of racial unrest, like the folks in St. Paul, Minnesota, where the Como Park Zoo was sort of a site of unrest following the George Floyd killing, at the Kentucky Science Center in Louisville, Kentucky was also a site of unrest and violence following the Breonna Taylor killing in Louisville. And so all of these institutions are reconsidering sort of what it means to be their institutions, how they address these issues, and sort of how they position themselves to continue being relevant in their communities. But these pieces down here, right, from where we sit, right, as researchers, right, systematic and standardized data collection matter, evaluation and assessment matter. These are the things that help us tell our story, right? And this is a compelling story, actually, right, from a lot of our research is that most museums and public libraries are not the economic engines that drive their local economies in their communities, right? They are important and critically important infrastructure, right, within their communities, but not from sort of based on the economic output that they're generating, right? It's all about the social relations, it's all about the networks they engender and the social cohesion that flows from it. Right, so when we talk to policymakers and we're talking to people that are funding museums and libraries, these are the points that we're emphasizing with them, and these are the points that we are emphasizing with them in our reporting. Right, so when we are talking to folks, and for ourselves, including because we're a funder for a lot of communities, we look at museums and libraries as assets in their communities that provide those connections and represent strength in otherwise distressed communities that you can build out from. Right? They are the connective tissue that are going to link people together to the resources that they need. And if you can identify them as partners, right, and understand how they connect to the different parts of their communities, you can use a museum and library within a sort of broader strategy of reinvestment, right, within communities where you're thinking about making investments. And this is the way we sort of talk to policymakers and to funders about thinking about museums and libraries as partners, right, in terms of their ability to activate the kinds of change that people are thinking about for their communities. And I think you can't lose sight of this second bullet here, right? I mean, this is one of the biggest currencies, right, of libraries, particularly of libraries everywhere across the country. When you think about public institutions, think about the current state of the political discourse in the country. Public libraries are probably the number one most trusted public entity in America. And people generally trust that the library is there to provide them with unbiased information. And that when you go into the library and ask someone how to get something done, you can generally trust that somebody there is going to genuinely help you try and do it, right? For no other reason than because you came in and asked, right? And that is a currency that no other institution in the United States can enjoy right now, right? And can lay claim to. And I think understanding that and helping sort of funders and policymakers understand that as sort of a point of entry into communities that they otherwise haven't been able to serve, is seeing libraries as that point of entry is really critical, and positioning yourselves as that, right, is something that's really critical from a library standpoint. And when we think about data collection, future research, and you guys are involved in doing some research, these are the kinds of things that, we're researchers, so this is a part where we kind of nerd out a little bit about the kinds of things we would love to be able to do. But some of the things that you guys are already planning to do, of refining the geographies to understand how these networks work in a more confined space, right? Particularly doing this in a smaller sort of geography of a small town or a rural community, it's possible to wrap your head around the totality of the network that a library or museum would be connected into, to really be able to understand how important or how critical the library is in activating connections across the community itself. And when you start to get to those kinds of that kind of level of analysis, where you're really trying to pin down and articulate the strength, the durability, the duration of the connections between the institution and other organizations and individuals, right, within a community, that's when you can really start to put your finger on, this is the quantitative effect, right, of a library within its community, because we can talk about the power of the network itself, the connectivity of the network, and the utility of it in helping people get things accomplished that they want to accomplish, right? And that doesn't sort of necessarily mean that we're able to quantify the contribution to GDP, right, within a community, but it gives you a way to talk about the indispensability of an institution for helping people meet their needs, right, through the networks that are maintained and activated by people's connections to libraries, museums, and to each other through them. And this is, an aspirational kind of list of the data collection that can help you be a good partner, right? So if Margot calls any of you and asks to see if you can participate in the study, or you're thinking about doing some evaluation of the work that you're doing, these kinds of institutional data collection activities are fairly straightforward for anybody reporting to the public library survey. Most of you are already capturing these things and reporting them pretty regularly. For those of you who don't, this is a great starting point for thinking about the kinds of data that are going to help you to develop a rigorous evaluation and assessment, not for your institution to do it, but for you, a research partner to do it with you, right? We love working with libraries. Margot is a researcher. There are other researchers out there that are doing work with libraries, and museums. And the biggest challenge that we encountered in working with the 24 different sites that we worked with is that most of them had something like this, but how they collected it and how they were able to provide it to us varied a great deal. Sometimes it was in a very nice spreadsheet. Sometimes it was on pieces of paper. Sometimes it was in 16 different spreadsheets in different places. So there's a lot, or sometimes it was in somebody's email, or a couple on email. Right? And so figuring out a way to standardize some of these things, or at least within your own institution, regularly keeping track of stuff like this, right, is a tremendous step towards the ability to support an evaluation with an outside researcher, right? And that was something that we encourage folks to think about when you're sort of just even thinking about evaluation. So I want to wrap up. This is sort of my last slide, and I'm not going to read everything on here, but I want to at least acknowledge and salute the fact that everybody in this room are doing amazing work. Right? The work that museums and libraries are doing, particularly the work that small museums and libraries are doing in small towns, is the kind of work that is going to keep our communities together. Right? Liz and I do work all over the country understanding how institutions fail people every day. But your institutions are full of the most optimistic people, doing really amazing work, and actually making our communities the places that people want to live. Christy, I'm very glad for you inviting us to come and do this. It's been a really tremendous privilege, and the more we get to work with library and museum folks, the more inspired I become and optimistic for what lies ahead. So I want to stop now and give us all a chance to have some questions and conversations, but really just to say thank you for all of the work that everyone here is doing. I'm going to stop the share so we can all see each other for our conversations.
Thank you so much for that. That was really stimulating too. Like I am excited to look at the slide deck again. And like I'm noting down, like I have a question about this, and then your next slide is about like policy implications. Like, oh, that you're answering my questions as I'm going along. So whatever you did with my brain there, good job. So let's open it up to anyone. I see there's stuff going on in the chat, but what kinds of questions come up as you all are listening to this, or comments?
We do have one question that I could read from someone. Linda writes, how would you propose to measure economic contribution via social value?
So there are a couple of different ways of thinking about this. None of them are very straightforward from an analytic standpoint. So when you think about the social value of something, say, graduating from high school, right? And if there's something that you can do from some way that you know that your programming is increasing the likelihood that students are going to graduate from high school because you are supporting their attendance, then you can create this causal pathway, right, through which your efforts are increasing the likelihood that they're going to attend, increasing the likelihood that they're going to graduate, and you can convert graduation from high school into a lifetime earnings return for people who get high school degrees. So the way to think about the social, converting social value into an economic value, right, is for particular kinds of outcomes that have a pretty well-established quantitative sort of methodology behind them. Right? There are some educational outcomes are pretty straightforward that way in terms of high school graduation, college completion, but also high quality childhood, early childhood education. But it's complicated, right? And it's a complicated case to make. The harder part of that is isolating and making a compelling case that what the library or the museum is doing is having a measurable effect on the likelihood that a student is going to graduate, while accounting for their regular educational experience. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that gets at one of my questions, and I'm being shy about letting silence just sit there, and I probably should longer, otherwise I'm going to talk too much. But this was coming up a bit, but it's still kind of rattling around for me, where like I think a lot about support for museums and libraries and like a future that's a little bit more stable than the present, or that we're moving toward that. And the I don't even know how to phrase this question exactly, but it's something about like without that causal link, which seems super hard to get, it feels as a librarian like irresponsible to go like touting these like I don't quite know what I'm saying when I'm saying there's these associations between libraries and these social well-being outcomes. If I'm talking to a legislator or some kind of decision maker, I'm leading them to believe there's a causal link, or and it feels super like it doesn't feel good.
Well, the way to think about that, Meg, is that the kinds of benefits that sort of come from the programming that you're doing don't lend themselves to observation within a randomized controlled environment that would provide them with somebody with a sort of causal sort of argument to make, right? And so you have to sort of change the way people think about what evidence means, right? And what evidence counts for articulating the benefits that accrue to people by virtue of the work that museums and libraries are doing. Right? And that's the benefit of the kind of thing that we did, was the triangulation of multiple methods of quantitative, qualitative, and then sort of grounded in existing literature and theory to point to, yeah, we can observe this quantitative association. And by the way, we went and talked to a bunch of people, and this is actually happening, and it happens this way, right? And it sort of fits within the existing theoretical framework for how this could happen. So that's pretty good evidence to say, there's something going on there. Right? Sarah, do you have a question? I see your hand up.
So, yeah, I did. what was the motivation or the indicator that had you choose social well-being in the first place to study? Is it something that you found that policymakers held as a value? I'm asking this because a professor friend and I are involved in a project in the UK where actually health and reading as promoting health and well-being is fundable. I'm wondering, and it's not in the US, so is social well-being something that's fundable in the US? Is that something you can speak to?
From a fundability standpoint, I think absolutely, right? And different funders think about it in different ways, right? So one of the data sources we used was the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation's community health indices for every county in the country. And Robert Wood Johnson does a bunch of work around social determinants of health and has a social well-being sort of framework for the way that they do their giving across their primary business lines, but it's usually designed to sort of promote a culture of health, right? That's what Robert Wood Johnson wants to do. But there's a pretty ongoing shift away from sort of single dimensions of sort of well-being, economic well-being, or GDP, sort of representing the overall health of a region. And sort of the use of and the intentional selection of sort of multidimensional well-being measures is a recognition of the fact that there are multiple facets of your life that generally construct what you would consider the quality of your life. And it's not just how much money you make or how much money you could make. It's the quality of the connections that you have to other institutions. It's the existence of arts and cultural institutions in the place. It's your access to healthcare, the quality of the educational system, how safe people feel in their communities, how well you can afford the housing in the place where you live. All of those things sort of intersect in different ways to sort of create the quality of your life.
Right. And also, I was wondering what kinds of data would you need to break out mental health? That's really a tough one, but that is a huge thing going on in the country right now.
It falls into, in our broad category, it falls into something like the Community Health Index, right?
Yeah, I noticed it wasn't on there.
Right. I don't think, because there aren't good measures, right, at a population level of like the share of people who say they're depressed, or the share of people. There is one of the measures on there is like, how many days in the past month would you say you had a good day, or you had a bad day, or things were overwhelming? So there are these well-being measures that we're using, and I think Liz probably is using a lot of them in her guaranteed income studies around how universal basic income programs promote the well-being, the mental well-being beneficiaries. And so we are setting up a guaranteed income study in Philadelphia, and one of our primary outcomes is whether or not the guaranteed income for very poor working mothers in Philadelphia improves their mental well-being. And so there are these instruments that we use, but there are surveys, right, that people have to complete every so often. Like, so at a population level, it's very hard to like get that. Liz, do you want to speak to that at all?
Yeah, there are definitely survey scales that you can, get a sense of mental health. But I think too, that is where, the qualitative aspect comes in. And what we saw in actually visiting these rural libraries is, so many of them were integral to mental health in their communities by providing places for people to gather who otherwise wouldn't, who this was like their outlet. This was the way that they said hello to people and had that human interaction. It's so hard to measure mental health. Like, you can only, there are ways to try, and there are survey scales out there for sure. But
right.
That's
one of the
my 2 cents.
That I'm in St. Lawrence County, and one of the things that we're having an issue with in our county right now is actually housing. where people with very severe mental health issues used to have safe housing that was in like a senior housing or something like that. It was a pretty safe environment for them. But as the general mental health has declined because of pandemic, the other populations aren't putting up with the serious ones anymore. And we're finding a lot of people that are being made homeless because they just have no place to go, and certainly not one that's safe for their severe issues. So it's interesting that other factors in your community get touched like that.
No, that's right. I mean, in small towns, museums and libraries have a really hard time extending into issues like housing, right? In a place like Milwaukee, Wisconsin, they're building new libraries across their entire system, and every library is on the first floor of a mixed-use building that has housing above. Sometimes it has an FQHC attached, but everything is mixed use, and it's all responsive to what the community says they want in the course of developing what the building's going to be. But they have a lot of resources, right? It's a big sort of legacy kind of library system.
Hey, I want to call attention to this comment from Linda in the chat, because I think there's something important going on here where she's saying, if you start driving libraries and museums with economic benefits that seem a stretch or fragile logic, does that create a risk of it reducing trust? And if not, does it take us down a path of prioritizing activities based on their ability to directly link to economic benefits? And what I want to bring up here, what seems worth discussing or like clarifying, is that what I think we're talking about here is expanding what counts as a worthwhile outcome, and that we can get away from money, like strictly like how much money ends up in whoever's pocket from this service, and we can say how much better off are people. And there's more ways that people can be better off than just how much money is in their pocket. That's one way that counts, totally matters. But that there's these other social well-being indicators, school performance. There was a list in one of their slides that's worth going back to. So I just want to sort of confirm that we're all talking about the same thing here.
Yep, and Linda, I think your concern is very well placed, and we, in our work, in the paper that in the report that we wrote, we encourage people to resist the urge to quantify and convert all outcomes into dollars, right? Because of the difficulty in making the causal link, right? That would be required to make the conceptual jump from sort of outcome to dollars, right? To begin with, and really focus on connections, networks, relationships that help people get their needs met, whatever those needs are, right? Because there are so many different reasons why someone shows up to a library, right? That don't necessarily intersect with a monetizable outcome, right? But the fact that you go to the library to get some information, to figure out how to do something, to meet with somebody in your community, to do interviews with somebody because they don't have anywhere else to go, right? There's value in every single one of those connections, and there's value in the place being there and being available for those connections to happen, and being able to figure out, right, what that network looks like, what the traffic, right, of activity that sort of flows through it, right, and then how centrally important that space itself is for activating those networks really starts to tell people about what does this institution mean to this community, right? Because when you take it out, right, where else would people go to get these things done, right? And in big urban places, there are other places to go to get some of these things done, right? In small towns, in rural communities, oftentimes there aren't.
And it's striking me that like the pressure that we can feel to connect everything we do to an economic outcome reflects our own distrust of these broken systems that we're all living within, that like anybody who has any amount of power cares about is the economic implications of things. And so I have to like put aside all of these really human values and talk to them about how my organization makes money, or like makes people economically, or like the economic impact of my organization. Like that's, I think, just my own distrust of systems coming through when that becomes my message.
Yeah, but it's a moment for resistance, right? And we all have to push back against that. I work at a bank, right? I mean, gee, like we lend money, right? But we know, right, that's not what it's all about, right? It's all about the relationships that these places sort of engender, and that's those relationships and those connections are sort of what make people's lives sort of go, right? And it isn't money that makes things go, right? It's people that makes things go. You got to help people understand, right, that these are spaces that it doesn't cost anything to go to, right? And that everybody can go to and do whatever it is that they need to do, right, within the confines of that space. And that there are people there to help them figure it out, right? And we shouldn't try and reduce the value of that to some dollar figure, because what that does is it devalues it, right? By trying to create that kind of sort of dollar value of the worth of social connections with one another to figure out collective and individual problems, we sort of devalue the process itself of getting our needs met. Right? Now, there's tremendous pressure, and I understand the tremendous pressure that you're under, and the folks in Yavapai, Arizona, every year do some sort of like cost per square foot analysis that they generate for the county commissioners, because the county commissioners want to see it or something. He's like, but you know, like I got some guy who does it, but that's not what we do here.
Yes, totally.
That pressure is real.
Oh.
That pressure is real, but like when we talk about the value of these institutions, we constantly land on the relations, the networks, and what those networks mean for how people are going to get their needs met and live their lives and build their communities. Right? And those are the things that matter to people, not whether or not every dollar invested in the library is going to generate $1.50 of economic activity.
I just wanted to quickly say that I think libraries and systems in New York and everywhere also have a part to play in reminding the people that they advocate to in demonstrating their value from those multidimensional frameworks, right? Like we have the ability to say anything to a legislator or a policymaker that we want. We can choose to include the $1 to $4 or whatever. And also, like, how many kids finished their pre-K education through the library? How many kids graduated high school through the library? Like, you can include those as well or more often than the other stuff. You know what I mean? Like, we have a part to play in making sure that we are also communicating the things that we value. And that's the way that we can resist some of those over monetizing of things that we don't need to monetize, I think.
Yeah, and extending like the scope of how we think about value and kind of, challenging the dominant narrative, right?
Well, if the inflationary period that we're living through right now is a message for any of us, right, it's that price doesn't really equal value. Right? I don't know, every economist will tell you it's true.
Yeah, you're moving. Does that mean you just bought a house and that you probably were dealing with some of that?
We did just buy a house and we're moving to a rural part of the country.
Congratulations. Oh, like You're in Philadelphia right now, right?
Actually, I'm in Columbus, Ohio, and we're moving to Blair, Nebraska, which is population 8,000.
How exciting.
Big small town.
That's going to be a fun change. That's cool. I see that Noah has a big long thing, and I can't quite read it fast enough, and it's 4:02. So I want to invite Noah to just unmic or unmute and see if you want to have the last word here.
Well, that's a dangerous thing to suggest, but I'll do my best. I was just saying, so obviously this report is about museums and libraries, but one thing that I didn't hear much about was opportunities for museums and libraries to support each other and to learn from each other. And I saw, as you highlight museum and library networks, and as the American Alliance of Museums, their new report really focuses on museums as community infrastructure. I wonder if you have any thoughts about how we can better work together rather than kind of think about doing this work as independent sectors.
Well, there are lots of opportunities for libraries and museums to collaborate, and in the places that we went, there were multiple examples of museums and libraries collaborating with one another. I think one of the best examples was in Louisville, Kentucky. The Kentucky Science Center had a partnership with, I don't know, maybe 20 different library systems across the Commonwealth to have sort of mobile exhibits that were on display. I think it was Science and Play to go, and it would show up in all of these different libraries across the country or across the state in Kentucky. And, Kentucky is predominantly a rural state, right? And so a lot of the people living in these places never have a chance to go to Louisville to experience what the Science Museum has to offer. And so it was essentially a rotating partnership that would bring programming to every corner of the state, which was pretty cool, right? And that's sort of a big scale partnership. Other ones were really sort of ad hoc in small towns, but they have to be intentionally developed and designed and thought through, right? And I know they're, from a sectoral standpoint, like museums have very different business models than libraries in terms of the way they behave, in terms of what they have to do day to day to sort of keep their businesses, their organizations running. And so it just depends on what their interests are and what the opportunities are for them. But it happens all the time, and IMLS is trying to encourage more people to do it. Folks, it's 4:05, and I know we've gone over. I'm happy to hang in a little bit if people want to chat or have questions. Everybody needs to go. I really appreciate you guys making time.
Same here. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you so much. I'm so glad to learn more about your work, and I'm so grateful. Margot's still here, so before you drop off, Margot, the really good news here is that this is really rich. This conversation, we could go a lot longer and deeper and further with this, and we have a few years to do that. So this is just the start of having this conversation together. And to Noah's point about collaborations or like how people can work together, support each other, like we absolutely want to work on that. And that's what the next couple of years are going to be dedicated to, and then sustained, because we've got a structure here that is sustainable with that kind of support. So I appreciate your comment, Leona. Thank God for this. Like, we really do have a stable foundation here through the library systems. And so I think we can take what Liz and Michael are telling us, we can build on it with what Margot's got for us, and maybe we can ask you guys back in a couple of years, and we can all talk together again.
As you go forward, if you ever want to, Margot emails me every so often asking me questions.
Yeah, good. I mean, I see, I saw in your presentation some comment, like, what do I want to say, like familiar things that I've talked with Margot about. Yeah, really fascinating, really good stuff.
Can I just like love on everybody? Just like just love on everybody. I just want to love on everybody. Liz and Mike, everything that you said was great, and I loved it. That's what I want to say. I agree with everything you said, unconditionally. Keep up the good work.